All right, so thank you for joining the third version of the Rihal Talks. So when I was first told that I was going to be speaking at the Rihal Talk, I thought to myself, what should I speak about? Should I be speaking about the latest advancements in data? Well, probably not. You know, over here at Rihal, data is our bread and butter, so I wouldn't be really adding much value. So another thought came to mind. Why not speak about microeconomics? Why not speak about supply and demand? You know, the very fundamentals of our economy. So those are my current areas of interest right now, and I believe that the diversity of ideas would make us all wiser. So a very interesting aspect of microeconomics is supply and demand. Here we have a supply and demand curve. What it tells us basically is that in the case of a perfect market, if we were to have price and quantity on two axes, the relationship between supply and demand would be at an equilibrium. Now, this is the part that's really relevant to us in Oman as a resource-rich country. We all know that relying on a single resource for funding an economy is not really sustainable. In fact, it's unsustainable. So this is why the government, as we see, tends to fund public expenditure through the imposition of taxes, which is what has been happening during the past few years, if you notice the changes. Hence, when the government interferes in the economy through the imposition of taxes, what happens is an immediate change in the equilibrium. So this representation right here is a very fancy way of saying that. If taxes are imposed, you will be able to buy much less at a higher price. The value of your money has actively reduced.
Sorry, the team on Teams can't see your face. If you can adjust the
Dr. Hamoud should have joined the session in office. Yeah. So what happens when taxes are imposed is a very interesting concept in what's called as behavioral economics. The concept of distortion is the difference between the spending pattern before and after taxes are imposed. So can you give me an example, anyone of course, of when the government actually uses distortion as a tool in the economy?
Plastic bag.
Exactly, that's a good one. Any more? Think about it, when has the government imposed a tax on something in order to promote or discourage a certain activity? Ahmed. Exactly. Any more? Exactly. That was the point I was coming to. So for example, if the government notices a negative behavior somewhere in the country, it would actually impose a tax on it to discourage certain behavior. For example, alcohol, cigarettes, fizzy drinks, which they consider as having negative effects on the human body. However, the flip side to that is that if the government wants to encourage a certain behavior, they can actually also impose a tax. For example, if the economy is somehow stagnant, people are saving money, nobody is spending. So to promote the overall transfer of money in the economy, the government can actually even tax your savings in a bank, which would make saving far more attractive. So this is a way that the government can use this as a tool. So that was what I initially wanted to speak about, microeconomics, but it's not anymore. When I prepared that first part of the presentation, something happened that left a really deep impact on me. It was a real eye-opener. Hence the new presentation a client once taught me. Can anyone guess what did the client teach me? This is the part where you answer. Maybe. That's a good one. Anyone else?
Discount?
Not really. Ayush.
The client is always right.
We learned that through experience, yes.
The client is watching this presentation.
I hope not. A client once taught me how to sell milk to a cow.
How to?
Sell milk to a cow.
Okay.
Does anybody know how? Okay. Well, the thing about selling milk to a cow is that it's a very interesting thought. Selling something that's completely unnecessary to someone who wouldn't even make use of it. That idea is quite intriguing. I believe that a lot of thought has to go into that. So when I first heard that phrase, this is exactly what came to mind. How is this even possible? Milk, handshakes, and a cow? I don't think that could be done. But alhamdulillah, I met my first cow. We actually sat down. We gathered the requirements. We even took a selfie after the kickoff meeting. Yeah, alhamdulillah. Yeah. We wanted to sit at the meeting table, but we couldn't, so we had to stand up at the field. But on a more serious note, I actually heard this phrase from an Italian businessman here in Oman. The better you are at communicating your ideas, the better you are at influencing people's behavior and ultimately altering their behavior even towards you, or even changing their minds. He told me that the only way to achieve such an endeavor would be through the use of words. So going on to another scenario, which was where the client actually taught me this. So a few weeks back, when I was preparing the first presentation, we went into a client meeting. So the clients were representing one of the largest multinationals in the world. Due to their immense expertise, these were subject matter experts, the absolute authority in their field. Due to the criticality of the project that we were working on, no mistakes could be tolerated. My team and myself had our guards up the whole time. Nothing we could say or do could be wrong. We should always be right. So in that scenario, the client went on to explain something. Someone from the client side went on to explain something to us, but actually made a mistake. So obviously my team and I realized this, but due to the situation, we couldn't say anything about it. So just an awkward silence took over the room. Here, when the room went silent, someone from the client side stepped up and said, "Forgive me if you are a couple of steps ahead and I'm bringing you back, but this is how it's actually done." So through the use of such a simple phrase, an intense situation could be dissipated. He completely turned the table without embarrassing anyone in the room. That left a very deep impression on me. How could I take my communication to the next level? If it was up to me, I would have said something completely different, which would have hurt the entire flow of the conversation, and perhaps even backfire on us as contract holders. So here, I set out to find some key parameters for effective communication. So number one would be professional alternatives. Number one, if somebody keeps on interrupting us, for example, we can just, instead of saying, "Stop interrupting me," we could say, "Thank you for your input, but please wait till I'm done sharing my thoughts before contributing." You started by thanking them, acknowledging that they have something to say and it's valuable. But you also told them that they could wait till you're done, just to facilitate a better conversation and better environment. Number two, if you have ignored meeting requests, you can just reply by saying that your attendance is required for this discussion. If the date and time does not work for you, please suggest a date and time that works on your end. Number three, if you can't make sense of what a person is saying, you can ask them to kindly help me better understand what is exactly that you require from my end. This way they can elaborate and give you what's exactly specific to you so that you can promote the conversation. Number four, Google it. How many times have we faced this? For example, we have a lot of problems that we may face, but the resources are available online. So the best alternative, instead of saying Google it, is you can just say that the internet is a great resource for such questions. In case you couldn't find these answers to your questions on the internet, I will readily be available to answer any questions. Number 5, we do not have a meet. We do not need to have a meeting about this. I'm sure that all the project managers will agree that currently their schedules are full with meetings. Some of them could have been emails, actually. We don't have to have meetings for everything. So what we can say is that, respectful of everyone's time, let us discuss this over email until we have a more defined agenda. And finally, if somebody's just delaying their tasks, instead of saying hurry up, you could just say, it is important that we have this complete in order to meet our targeted deadlines that are quickly approaching. So these were some quick alternatives for daily corporate communication. Now, the art of apologizing. I really believe that each and every one of us shows up to work with the best intentions in the morning. We all want to do our best, but mistakes are going to happen. That's non-negotiable. Things like that always happen. Now, apologizing when you make a mistake with the word sorry, it adds some type of guilt to it, which you did not intend in the first place. So you have actually a few alternatives that you may use, such as, good catch, thanks for picking that up. Number 2, appreciate you highlighting that. Let me change it. Number 4, thanks for flagging. I'll update it right now. And my personal favorite, thanks for pointing that out. Is there anything else that I missed? Tariq knows that the best. He's been receiving that a lot from me. Number 2 is the open door technique. It allows you to explore much more options while keeping it. It allows you to explore much more options while keeping it optional without you committing to anything. Really, it's a really effective influencing technique and a negotiating technique just through the use of a few phrases. For like, just suppose, I wonder whether, what if. So if I may give you a scenario. Some changes are requested and they do not fit into your current project timeline. So you may just use the phrase that, just suppose that we accommodated the changes that you requested. Would that fit into our timeline? Just pose it as a question. Do not commit to it. Most probably the client would be replying to you and saying, no, it actually does not fit. But what you could do over there is just wait for it and then say, would you be able to accommodate a few more resources? Then we might be able to achieve the changes that you requested, which actually translates into more money. So finally, general conduct in a meeting. The final axis is the general conduct in a meeting. It's definitely one of the key parameters that you have to retain during any business setting, or any meeting that you may enter. So number 1 is keep silent or keep quiet. Don't make the common mistake of replying too fast. Giving a person time to speak will allow you to understand much more, to actually digest what they have to say. So then once they finish speaking, give them around 10 seconds, digest what they had to say, then you may come back with a positive reply or something that will actually facilitate the flow of the conversation. Number 2 is ask questions. Questions are actually the engines of any communication. One question will always lead to another. Answers will always lead to another, until you have a holistic view of what is actually discussed. Number 3 is listen actively. Listening isn't the same as hearing. When you listen, you would nod, you would engage, you would actually accept what the person is saying or even decline it. But you will have to listen and actually to achieve that. And when you listen actively through the use of your body language, you also add some type of empathy to it. Number 4 is body language. It's a huge part of nonverbal communication. People who actually nod, people who actually roll their eyes, rest their chins on their fists, or use their smartphones, are actually telling us that they're not interested in the conversation that we're having. So let's try to avoid that when we go into a business setting. Number 5 is build connections. Take personal interest in what a person does, research their backgrounds, find out what their interests are. One thing I learned since joining Rihal is that you can use LinkedIn as a tool. Just before entering any meeting, especially with a new client, research their background. Know what they're about, what might interest them. that will really help you facilitate the communication as you go forward in the meetings. Alhamdulillah, I have applied this once, and it really helped ease so many tense spots in projects. And finally, show empathy. Working at Rihal is definitely not an easy task. We all know this. Just think about the recruitment process that you have been through before joining Rihal. Many have attempted the quiz, but not many made it. And once you entered Rihal, notice that no 2 days are the same. It's a really high-paced environment. So adding a human touch to your interactions with your colleagues will really go a long way. Thank you very much. So this is what I had to say initially. Now,
How do you sound?
لا. I actually just left you with the keys of change. But it's up to each and every one of you to open them. So these are some great resources that you may use to increase your span of knowledge in the fields of communication. Thank you. Yeah. I'll be having questions now, if any. Yes, Ahmed.
There was a book I was reading. It mentioned the story about a specific airline in the world. They had two major accidents in 1908 and 1909. Okay. So I was reading a book about a story regarding an airline who lost two airplanes due to a crash in 98, 99. When they were investigating the issue, co-pilot was trying, at least in one of the accidents, was trying to communicate to the captain that, hey, you're gonna hit an obstacle. You need to lift and so on and so forth. However, he was not that direct. And when they were studying what was going on, they found that the language itself inherently encouraged the use of using indirect commands, especially when there's a chain of command.
Mm-hmm.
When you're the subordinate communicating something to your supervisor, you cannot be that direct. Hence, further encouraging the person not to be that direct. Typically, I'm more of a blunt person, and that encouraged me to be that way as well. But another story, which makes me sometimes wonder which way to go about, a friend of mine was visiting an ambassador. And honestly, when he went there with a request that should have been rejected, but he was kind enough to meet my friend. 30 minutes into the discussion, he lifted his cup of water, drinking it, and the ambassador said, "Oh, you're leaving." So my friend told me, it's true how diplomatic this person is. He was able to say, "Okay, it's time up," without saying it's time up.
True.
So sometimes being indirect is better. Sometimes being direct it's better, and sometimes, in many cases, I'm like, okay, which way should I go with? So, given that you just mentioned this talk today, what do you think about that? And how do you strike a balance? And when do you decide to be blunt? And when do you decide to be, careful with your words?
Yeah. So you mentioned two examples. That's a very good scenario and question, actually. So you mentioned two examples. First, the first one, with the pilot, the use of indirect language was negative. But in the second, the use of indirect language was something positive. So it actually depends on the criticality of the situation at hand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So lives were at stake there. If he were to switch to direct communication, it would have possibly saved lives. And the second, it was some sort of a courtesy, some sort of professional encounter. So he couldn't really be blunt about it. So I think it depends on the setting that we are in.
What about in your case? Have you met or engaged with clients? Sometimes being blunt was the better way.
I believe so, yes.
And were you blunt?
Say one thing, don't encourage him. I know what he's going through.
No, from your experience. I just want to learn from his experience.
Yeah. Well, usually for the types of clients that we had, most of them were professional. It was just that at sometimes where changes were being introduced that were not part of the scope and did not make any sense to be introduced. So then I would have to back up the technical team with a certain bluntness. And sometimes when meeting times have been exceeded, I had to just cut it off right there. Yeah. For example, we had a 30-minute meeting, and it went on for an hour. Yeah. Of course, the first 15 extra minutes were beneficial to the conversation. Yeah. But the remaining 15 were not. So there I had to cut it off. So it really depends on the situation that you're in.
Good
Yeah.
point. Agreed. Thank you.
Most welcome.
So Ahmed, the limestone meeting room is about to crash into a mountain.
No, by the way, whenever I would ask people about where do they draw the line, they always point me to Asim to learn to learn about that from him.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm asking about different examples and how you manage those different examples.
Yeah. I think also speaking about Asim, yani, when a person does not have a lot of time at hand, it's better to be direct. For example, Asim, we know, is in and out of meetings all the time. So just go in, point 1, 2, 3, then leave. That would be it.
Agreed.
Yeah. Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Azhar.
I have two comments. One comment is what you talk about is partially communication.
Yeah.
How to sell milk to a cow. You need to have a communication. But the other part, which I feel it's embedded, it's politics.
Yeah.
Part of being project manager or a manager or even a developer in your day-to-day work is to be political with your friend next to you, with your client, with the teamwork, with the environment you're in. Because being political doesn't mean you cheat someone, but it means you consider their emotions, you consider their intelligence, you consider maybe they are ill or their family is ill. So sometimes you come harsh to them and things break out. And this can happen with our clients. Sometimes they are pushed by their managers and we don't know that. And you see that push from them and you're actually having a question mark. Why did he change on me? And the idea that you need to reconsider what's behind it. And this is part of the gap. The other comment is you mentioned something about ask questions on a meeting. And you reminded me of a movie I was watching. It was with a father and his daughter, which is 5 years old. And he wanted to leave the house and go for a travel. And he was telling his daughter, 5 years old. And she was asking why. Every time he tells her, her reply is why. It reminded me of the 5 why method, where you actually try to find the root cause. But when you think of it, that's a 5-year-old girl. She doesn't understand the 5 why method. But what she understands is that because it's not clear with her, she keep asking why. And this is why sometimes we need to ask ourselves while we are in a meeting. Why is the client asking for that? Why is this his demand right now? Why did he change? So every why we try to do or every question we do, we will get the root cause and we will get sometimes, I think if Ahmed Majdi is here today, Ahmed is here. He was telling me when he was talking about the product designer, he said, I want to know what's the pain area, what are they wanted. Then I can design it for them. And for him to know what they wanted, he has to ask questions to get it out of them. Sometimes there's a communication barrier where they will not just tell you what they want. They think they told you what they want, but it's not there. So I think these two things are implied in your presentation, but I just wanted to share them out with everyone.
Anyone else has a question? Perhaps a comment? One thing, Asim, I believe just a continuation of what you said. In terms of technical delivery, I have not noticed any shortcomings over here in Rihal. But as we move forward, as Rihal grows, we will have to take our communication to the next level because there will be much more communications with clients, things like that.
So overall, just as a summary, is that we need to put ourselves in their shoes and expect what they want from us. And a very important point is to never, ever presume anything.
Yeah.
If you presume anything, it might be based on a minimum fact that basically doesn't translate to any truth. So that's the key takeaway. You need to find the actual thing, and then you build whatever expectation from that minimum fact.
True. Thank you very much, Mohammed. Tariq, do you have any questions on Teams? No? All right. Yeah. I believe the point that you just mentioned touches on the point of empathy, placing yourself in the shoes of somebody else, the client, let me say. As you all said, they may face pressure from their bosses, which is something that we saw really often in our projects. They may be facing a shortage in the budget. We may be achieving something at a very slow rate, which may add some concern to something. So that's the point of empathy that was just mentioned.
If you go back one slide, or the slide that's afterwards. Actually, I was what's
Resources?
the last one, the last resources page.
Yeah.
I was struggling to find out who that is, but then I figured it out.
Yeah.
She's very trending on TikTok. So
Exactly. Exactly.
I suggest everyone
Yeah.
to check out her profile. It's basically she talks about how to deal with people, how to reply back, especially on Teams meetings,
Mhm.
and replying back to emails. It's very, it's trending in a way that she's kind of funny, but she's delivering actually a real value at the end of the day.
Yeah, true. So that was for Laura Haley,
Yep.
as Mohammed mentioned. For Shahda, she is actually a psychologist that works in the field of business. She tries to provide alternatives and negotiation techniques that would be very relevant to all of us. So I do suggest that you follow her both on LinkedIn and on Instagram. They have the same handle. And for Stefano, he actually lives over here in Amman. He has almost 8 businesses here in Amman. I first met him in 2018 in a TED Talk, which he gave about the power of communication. He used many different alternatives and small phrases. For example, one very good example that he gave is that if you are requested something, you may just say, "We will deal with your request accordingly." That word accordingly doesn't really mean anything. But just adding it at the end makes the huge difference. Yeah. So these are the things that we should focus on moving on.
There's a psychologist that I follow. He says a lot of people know why they reach certain conclusions, which might be justifiable. The struggle, however, is not being able to articulate the reasons on why they reach that conclusion. As a result, to practice articulating your thoughts accurately, practice writing. If you have good writing skills, you probably can speak about your reasons even more accurately. So I found that in many situations where I took a certain stance, the other party was not able to be convinced, even though I felt like it was the best decision moving forward. It's because I could not articulate my thoughts or reasons. That made a huge difference once I started paying attention on why did I reach this conclusion. And yeah, in most cases it solved most of my problems. That's another part of communicating as well.
Yeah, true. These small exercises really do help us, I
Yeah.
believe. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, something that I learned today. Yeah. Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you.
So Lazar, you mentioned like these techniques and tips on how to deal with the client, but how can you apply these as a project manager when dealing with like the technical team, for example, or the developers?
All right.
As in, like one way to put this question is to say, like, have you faced any challenges when dealing with the technical team, and how did you like solve those challenges?
Okay, I may refer you to one example that I put on here. So I know that everybody over here is working to their best possible level. So if I want to say hurry up, yeah, that's my go-to actually. I would just say it is important that we have this completed so that we can achieve our tasks given the approaching deadlines. I know that they did not neglect it on purpose, but it just happened due to the overload and due to the work that they have. They are prioritizing their backlog. That's how it works, for example. Yeah.
You know, they say good leaders not only communicate the what, but also the why. And that's why people trust them, right? Because they can align with your why.
Yeah.
So if I tell you, hey, we need to do something, I will have to go the extra step in explaining why are we doing that. So if you're imposing a strict deadline, it will be also beneficial to explain why are we meeting that deadline. Now, obviously, if someone said, I'm going to meet this deadline, and they're not meeting it, you're accountable for your words. That's another story.
Yeah.
But if it's something that is imposed on a person, then that's where it's very critical to explain the why so that everyone can be on board, on the same page, believing in the same thing, working on the common goal as well.
I agree. I believe that's why we have everybody on the same page over here when we work. So, for example, if there was a deadline that was set, we all know why it was set. Yeah. So, when we work collectively as a team, we're all on the same page, I would say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question on the first part of the presentation.
Sure.
So I have a question on the microeconomics side of things. I'd love to hear your take on the rising interest rates
We're just-
implemented by the Federal Reserve in the U.S.
Yeah. We were just having discussion about this, me and Muhammad, just a week back. There are different schools of thought when it comes to fiscal policy and monetary policy. So if we were to speak about fiscal policy, it was about cutting spending and imposing taxation. That was one. But monetary policy is about controlling the supply and demand of money in the economy and adjusting the interest rate. So what I see is that we can do one without the other, fiscal policies. But that's just from, let me say, a non-academic appreciation of the matter, as a disclaimer, from what I've seen. Because I've seen many examples of countries that have achieved lower inflation rates through just relying on fiscal policies rather than monetary policies, without the interest rates, of course.
Okay. And how would that relate to inflation?
Interest and inflation.
Yeah.
Well, if we were to impose interest on something, it would make spending much less attractive, for example. Yeah, so things might go cheaper. So the inflation, the value of money would also be altered at that stage. So they all go hand in hand. They're very subjective. There is a lot of trial and error, as we see historically. And that's how it is, basically.
So, in a nutshell, manipulation of the supply and demand.
Excuse me?
Manipulation of the supply and demand.
Even this is quite subjective. So for example, we have the equilibrium over here. When we impose taxation, the equilibrium shifted to the left. So anything above the equilibrium price, the tax over here is borne by the consumer. Anything below it is borne by the supplier or the producer of the product or service. So that's a very tricky area. This can also be manipulated. For example, the price may actually go up, but the tax is not always borne by the end user. For example, the producer or the supplier might say, we will actually hold the burden of the tax. They may actually even raise their prices and say the exact same thing, which is some sort of manipulation.
Yeah.
So this field of economics is very subjective. It can be tampered with. And that's why it's really important to educate ourselves on supply and demand.
Should we start buying Bitcoin then?
I wouldn't be the person to ask.
I have a question
Yes.
about reading the situation. You mentioned there that if you see someone is like using his phone during the conversation, that means he's not interested. I want to know what is the best action when you see this person is either lift him or tell him something.
From the top of my head, I would say that you have to point it out. You have to tell them that in this conversation, in order to make progress, I will require your full attention. You can point it out once or twice. If they do not like it, they do not comply with you, you may just leave them alone. Then you have to.
The position of the person?
I would just escalate it, you know.
So, if it's an audience like this, yeah, you can say, guys, please do. But if it's a meeting, there's two reasons for it. Either you're not grabbing their attention, it means that your volume or the sound or the language you're using is not connecting with them, or actually they came forced and they're not interested.
Okay.
So it's most of the time one of the two. So this is why one of the reasons I said open the cameras on your meetings. Body language is one of the ways in meetings. It's not only the sound. So you can hear someone, but as you said, they will roll their eyes. How would you know they roll their eyes if you don't have the camera? You don't see the body language. And you have a defensive approach, which we all know. If you're sitting like this, Doesn't mean always if you're sitting like this you're defensive, but there's some other signs to it. If you take your Ahmed for an example right now, is he defensive or not? Okay, he might be cold. That's why he's sitting that way. So you need to look at the communication, and this is part of communication. So you have the physical, which is the body language. You have the tone. This is why the good speakers, if you find, they will speak in a different tones. They will not speak in one tone. And the reason is that if they want to emphasize on something, they will either raise their pitch, or they will choose the words, or they will stop at that word for you to know it. These are all tricks in communication for you to grab their attention. I wouldn't recommend anyone to go to someone and tell him, please let your phone down, I'm speaking to you. That's rude, even though you're right, but the other guy will take it oppositely. He will not take it in a way. So just try to find your way of communicating without being blunt about it.
Yeah. So
Is it okay to say,
Sometimes what happens if they get a call in the middle and you know he's like a director, a manager, or he's usually busy, he's a project manager, usually busy, what I usually say is that if you want to take a call, I can wait. Sometimes they take the call, which is better for me, so they get out of it because they will be thinking about it while I'm talking to them. They miss that call. And sometimes they say, no, he'll close it, he'll put his phone away, and I know he's more engaged with me than that call. So all of these are measures for you to understand the engagement between you and the person speaking to.
this is the difference between knowledge and experience. Yeah.
Nice.
All right. Thank you very much, team. Thank you for joining. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much for joining online as well.